Cunningham here with Phil Long, and we're in the midst of a stack of a lot of hot days. We've got some behind our belt already, a couple of weeks of hot days coming up. We're accumulating GDUs at a rapid pace right now. A lot of you are maybe finishing up post-spray, thinking about some side dressing, and that's where some of our questions have been coming in this past week is regarding nitrogen application. So Phil, much of Latham country right now is facing really dry conditions also. So what can we expect for nitrogen use thus far?
Sure, yeah, it seems like if you look, I know I use as a gauge the Drought Monitor, and it's kind of been a little depressing the last month or two, thinking, maybe we'd put a dent in some of these drought conditions, and really haven't. I mean, most of Latham country is in at least abnormally dry, if not a D1, D2, even D3 drought in some areas, which is obviously not what we want to see this early in the season. May help some of the roots get down if they can find that moisture and follow it down, but obviously we're not used to seeing this limited of moisture, so not a good situation. So the first thing to think about when it comes to nitrogen that I think about is, how did you do it up front? Do you have nitrogen down? Most likely most farmers do. Maybe they have all of it down. In some cases it goes back to what we're going to talk about today, timing and form and all these things. So how did you put it down? Was it last fall as anhydrous, or was it this spring as a pre or something like that? In most cases, unless you left it on the surface, you probably had good utilization, because we had decent moisture early on. So even if it was down with a pre as UAN or something, or even incorporated as urea, the incorporation is key this spring. I would say even with herbicides, from what I've seen in a lot of cases, if you didn't incorporate, most of us are regretting those decisions probably. So just not enough moisture to get things going. Half inch to an inch, what we usually like to see. Haven't seen it in a lot of cases. I mean, we have some areas that have, but it's been a tough go of it for a lot of areas. So just remember, think back to how much nitrogen you had down. If you left it on the surface, there's a good chance that you might have lost potentially 20 or so percent, maybe even up to 30%, if it was down as urea form or UAN and so forth, in contact with residue especially. So all those things kind of come into play, and keeping in mind we're limited moisture right now. It still looks dry in the future cast. I'd say the next 10 to 15 days or so, and that's not a good thing, but we got to keep in mind that those two kind of go together. So we want to get enough of nitrogen on there for the corn to do what it needs to do to yield well, but obviously if we don't have moisture, the corn is not going to take up nitrogen as well. So you got to kind of play those two cards together when you're thinking about side dressing nitrogen, getting that extra boost on for the crop. Maybe backing off a little bit might be a good situation if you put enough up front, but you still want to have enough out there to get the yields that you're shooting for.
Okay, so how do we determine what to apply, and maybe is more important this year when to apply?
Sure, yeah, so we're standing right now, this is about V6 corn roughly. It's starting to finally get some green color to it. We've struggled a little bit with that here, but it's starting to look a little better. This heat is really going to push things along quickly. So the timing is really important. So we talk a lot about corn in terms of staging and when it takes up. If we're looking at corn right at when it throws a tassel around that R1 time frame, it's taken up 60% of the nitrogen by then. So between now and R1, it's going to take up a lot of nitrogen. On average, close to 2.5 or a little over 2.5 pounds per day. I mean, it takes up a lot of nitrogen once it gets into this period of rapid growth, which is around this V10 time frame. So that's why, hence the side dress is typically V6 to V8, this kind of timing. You get it out there and it becomes available right when the crop really starts to ramp up its uptake, that rapid uptake period up to R1. Obviously it takes up after it starts flowering, getting into setting that ear and so forth, but this really is a critical time. You don't want to starve the corn plant for nitrogen at any point. So you want to keep it green and healthy. That's one of the easy indicators, I guess, if you will, to make sure it's not starving. But just want to remember that it's really important to have that nitrogen down when the corn plant needs it. A lot of our more modern hybrids, we've seen research in the last couple decades have shown that the modern hybrids can take up to 40% more nitrogen after flowering. So they really do extend that period. A lot of farmers are talking about waiting and putting on nitrogen a little later. And a lot of these hybrids do take advantage of that. So, I talk a lot about ear ear type and so forth, that kind of plays a role as well. But these corn hybrids are a lot more efficient at utilizing nitrogen. However, I'll go back to the weather thing. Mother Nature's always king, and if it turns off absolutely dry, things are kind of out of our hands. But so in this case, to me, I'd say we have in this scenario, we have a little under half nitrogen down up front with a pre-herbicide. I'm going to come back right now because I don't want to miss that. I don't want it to have a gap where it's yellow, because at that point where it's trying to set the year around V5, V7 time frame, that girth of the year, we don't want to have yellow. So I'm going to make sure that we have enough down to cover that period. V6 to V8 is really the key time. But if you're looking to wait a little later, really that V12 to V15 time frame is a good time frame to shoot for. That'll put it on right before really kernel set. When we get up to that R1, when it starts to throw a tassel and stuff, it's already figured out the girth, and it's already figured out the length, the potential kernels, and now it's trying to establish, well, hopefully we have moisture by then, but it's really establishing how many of those are going to set. Hopefully not no failure in pollination and so forth, but it'll help kind of finish that out. Like I said, a lot of our modern hybrids do take up more nitrogen after flowering. So that's what that extra boost late season, Y drops and so forth are really good for that, providing that all season kind of, spoon feeding, if you will, the crop, keeping it healthy through that period as well. So really, I talk about it a lot, but there's, it's figuring out the girth right now. That's kind of the first key time frame. And then R1, it's figured by R1, it's figured out that length. And then after that, it's going to really, essentially, it's going to either abort or keep those kernels, depending on moisture. So kind of three key time frames in there that I would make sure to remember if you're trying to spread out your side dressing applications. The other thing that's probably most important is the source. At this point, it's probably tough to change, but if you're considering changing, just think about the dry conditions. The one thing I'd say, if you're doing UAN is a great source, urea ammonium nitrate. So we've got about half in ammonium nitrate, which is quickly available to the plant. Urea will have to be converted just like a urea granular fertilizer. But making sure that it's incorporated, whether that's with coulters or however you do it, if you're dribbling with Y drops or some other source close to the row, I'd let it get some canopy. If you can, let the crop get a little bit taller, get that shading down there, because you got to remember that the corn funnels water in. So even dew and so forth, it's going to funnel that down. That's why you see, within the row is wet a lot of times when we get close to pollination, because we may not have much moisture, but it's funneling, and it's very efficient at moisture and sunlight interception. So, just remember that incorporation is key, as well as with urea. If you're using urea, I would personally do it earlier, so we don't, avoid some leaf burn and so forth, and make sure that it's coated, whether that's some kind of a smart urea or just a sulfur coated, something with agritane or something that'll protect that for a little bit longer. There's other options as well, anhydrous and so forth is a great option, to put down as well. I would personally probably go a little deeper to make sure it's in moisture, and like I said, limited moisture. I'm keeping it away from the roots, so we don't burn things and so forth. So if you get it in moisture, it's going to be activated and converted more quickly. If we don't have the moisture, a lot of these, like I said, UAN is probably your best bet, but a lot of these won't be converted. Urea still has to be converted by that urease enzyme. So that's why we always say incorporation, you don't want it in contact with residues. But if we can get some rain, it'll start to break it down and get it down into the soil profile. So if you can get something deeper in the ground, whether it's UAN with coulters or anhydrous or something, that's probably ideal in case we don't get a lot of nitrogen movement down into the profile. So, it's always the hardest thing about farming and agronomy. It seems like it's being a predictor of the weather, and I definitely didn't go to school for that. So. All right.
Any closing thoughts then? Lots of variables going on, things to think about.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is just keep in mind right now where we're sitting at. A lot of farmers are doing their post corn spray and so forth. Probably working on side dressing. Just remember, those two are really tied together. So the water uptake and nitrogen uptake, nitrogen nitrate moves with the water. It typically is taken up by mass flow, so it's moving with the water to the roots of the corn and being taken up with the water. It needs water to get up into the plant. So if we don't have moisture, if you have a lot of nitrogen down already, you're seeing really good green color, you know, it may be a case where maybe it's not going to pay to put, you know, the highest amount that you maybe thought. So backing off a little bit might be a good idea. Obviously, you know, this would be the high yield folks that are trying to hit, you know, really potentially high yield. If we don't have moisture conditions that'll get that nitrogen down in the soil profile and available to the plant, a lot of times we don't realize that our nitrogen is not fully utilized. You may put 220 pounds out there, but maybe only 100, 120 pounds of it's actually utilized by the plant. So just keep that in mind. You know, we don't want to necessarily spend a lot of extra money. You know, nitrogen is a large expense, and the corn plant especially modern hybrids are very efficient at utilizing it. So, you know, that water component is the key and really important. If we're not going to get moisture, you know, like I said, we're guessing here, but it's in its early season. So if you can, wait a little longer. If you have the option to go in later with Y drops or something, it might be a good year to do that.
Okay, great tips. Well, thank you, Phil. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in this week. It's going to be a hot one out there, starting with today. So stay safe while you're working out in the fields. We'll be back next week with another episode of Ask the Agronomist.